"Get him out of my lobby. He doesn't belong here." The words didn't echo. They cut, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the polished silence of the luxury hotel like a blade across glass. At exactly 9:42 a.m., under a chandelier that cost more than most people's annual salary, Darius Coleman stood still in the center of the marble lobby, his presence calm, grounded, almost immovable. He wore a plain black t-shirt, fitted jeans, and clean white sneakers. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, nothing that screamed power to the untrained eye. And that was exactly the problem. The manager, a tall white man in a tailored navy suit named Richard Halston, stepped forward with the kind of authority that came from habit, not merit. His jaw was tight, his smile thin, and his eyes already decided. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time," Richard said, louder now, making sure the nearby guests could hear. "This is a private property. You can't just walk in off the street." Darius didn't respond. Not immediately. He simply looked around. The lobby was pristine, polished marble floors reflecting soft golden light, a row of leather chairs aligned with surgical precision, a faint scent of cedar and citrus hanging in the air. Everything about this place whispered exclusivity. Everything about it was designed to say, not everyone belongs here. And yet, Darius remained exactly where he was. Unmoved, unbothered, as if the ground beneath him answered to someone else entirely. A woman at the front desk leaned toward a colleague and whispered, not quietly enough. He didn't even check in. Another staff member added under her breath, "Probably trying to use the restroom or something." A soft ripple of judgment moved through the room. Guests glanced up from their phones. A man in a gray suit paused mid-sip of his espresso. A couple near the elevator exchanged a look, one of those silent agreements people make when they think they've already figured someone out. Richard took another step closer. "We have standards here," he said, his voice tightening. "If you're not a registered guest, I need you to leave." Still, Darius said nothing. His silence wasn't hesitation. It wasn't confusion. It was control. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that forces everyone else to fill the space and reveal exactly who they are. Near the concierge desk, a young employee named Emily shifted uncomfortably. She glanced at the system screen in front of her, then back at Darius, then back again. Something didn't sit right, but she didn't speak. Not yet, because the room was already leaning in one direction, and it was easier to follow than to challenge. "Security," Richard called out, not breaking eye contact. The word landed heavy, like a gavel sealing a verdict that hadn't been questioned. From the far end of the lobby, a uniformed guard began walking over, his posture firm, his expression neutral, but alert. The energy in the room shifted. It wasn't quiet anymore. It was charged, like something was about to snap, but no one knew exactly what. A man near the lounge area slowly raised his phone, pretending to check a message, but angling the camera just enough to capture what was happening. Another guest leaned forward in her seat, eyes narrowing. "This doesn't feel right," she murmured, almost to herself. But no one answered, because moments like this don't need confirmation. They need courage, and courage was still catching up. Richard gestured toward the entrance. "Last chance," he said, his tone final now. "Walk out, or we'll escort you out." Darius finally moved, just slightly, not toward the door, not away. He adjusted his stance, as if settling deeper into the moment rather than stepping out of it. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "No ruse, no tensión, just precision." He glanced at the screen, tapped once, and lifted it to his ear. "Yeah," he said quietly, his voice calm, steady, almost detached from the chaos building around him. "Go ahead and start phase 2. There was a pause, a brief one, but in that pause, something shifted. Not in the room, not yet, but in him, because while everyone else was reacting, escalating, assuming, Darius was executing. And the difference between those two things was about to change everything. The call did not last long, but it did not need to. Darius lowered the phone with the same steady control he had shown from the moment he stepped into the lobby, and for a brief second, nothing changed on the surface. The marble floors still gleamed, the chandelier still cast its soft gold glow, and Richard Halston still stood there with his authority wrapped tightly around him like a tailored suit. But something beneath it all had shifted, quiet and irreversible, like a switch flipped behind the walls. Phase 2, Richard repeated with a faint scoff, the corner of his mouth curling, as if the words themselves were laughable. This is not a game, sir. You cannot just stand here and make calls like that and expect it to mean anything. His voice grew louder, sharper, reaching for control that was already beginning to slip. The security guard had closed the distance now, stopping just a few feet from Darius, waiting for the final instruction. He did not touch him. He did not need to. Presence alone was supposed to be enough. That was how these moments usually worked. But this was not one of those moments. Darius did not look at the guard. He did not look at Richard. Instead, his gaze drifted across the lobby again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if he were memorizing details that everyone else had taken for granted. The front desk, the layout, the positioning of staff, the way the room responded under pressure. "Sir," the guard said finally, his tone measured but firm, "I need you to come with me." It was not a threat. It was not aggressive, but it carried the weight of expectation. Compliance. Movement. Resolution. Darius turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. "You might want to hold off," he said quietly. Not defensive, not confrontational, just certain. The guard hesitated. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there, because certainty, when it is real, has a way of interrupting routine. Richard stepped in quickly, filling that hesitation with force. "No," he snapped. "We are not waiting. This is exactly how situations get out of control. He is not a guest. He has no business here." Actually, the voice came from behind the desk. Soft at first, almost swallowed by the tension. But it did not disappear. Emily. She was still staring at her screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, her expression caught between doubt and realization. "Actually, I think," she stopped herself, looked up, then down again. The room felt heavier now, like every word had consequences. Richard turned sharply. "What is it?" he demanded. Emily swallowed. "There is a reservation," she said, her voice gaining just enough strength to be heard. "Under the name Coleman. Is flagged as high tier, executive level." A pause. Not long, but long enough. Richard's expression did not change right away. It held, then tightened. "That is not possible," he said flatly. "Check again." Emily did. Her fingers moved faster now, pulling up additional details, scanning lines that suddenly mattered more than they had seconds ago. "It is confirmed," she said. "Checked in remotely. Suite level access." A murmur rippled through the lobby. Small, controlled, but growing. The man with the phone adjusted his angle. The couple near the elevator leaned closer. The energy was shifting, not dramatically, but undeniably. Richard exhaled slowly, as if recalibrating his position in real time. "Even if that were true," he said, his tone carefully reconstructed, "that does not explain his behavior. Guests do not just walk in and ignore staff instructions." Darius finally looked at him directly, and for the first time, there was something different in his eyes. Not anger, not frustration, just clarity. "Interesting," Darius said, "because from where I'm standing, it looks like staff ignored the guest first." The words did not rise. They did not need to. They landed clean, precise. The guard shifted his weight slightly, no longer certain where to place himself in the situation. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out immediately, because the narrative he had built just seconds ago was beginning to fracture. And fractures spread fast when the foundation is weak. Emily spoke again, quieter now, but steadier. "There is more," she said. Richard did not turn this time. He already knew he was losing control of the room. "What?" he asked, his voice lower. Emily looked at the screen, then at Darius, then back again. "The account is not just high tier," she said. "It is marked under ownership access." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the room like a weight that no one could immediately lift. And for the first time since this began, Richard Halston did not have a response ready. The word ownership did not explode through the room. It did something far more dangerous. It settled, quiet, heavy, final. And in that silence, everything that had just happened began to rearrange itself in real time. Richard Halston blinked once, then again, as if the word had not fully registered. "That is incorrect," he said, but the certainty in his voice was gone. It did not disappear all at once. It thinned. It fractured. It left just enough behind to sound like resistance, not truth. Emily did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned the monitor slightly, just enough for Richard to see what she was seeing. Lines of data. Autorización tax. Access levels that did not belong to ordinary guests. And there it was. Clear. Undeniable. Ownership access. Richard leaned in, his posture no longer composed, but pulled forward by something closer to disbelief. His eyes scanned the screen quickly, then again slower, as if repetition might change the outcome. It did not. Behind him, the staff had gone quiet. Not instructed, not commanded, just quiet. Because moments like this do not need direction. They demand attention. The security guard took a small step back. It was not a retreat, not officially, but it was distance. Space created instinctively when authority becomes uncertain. Darius remained exactly where he had been. Still, balanced, as if none of this surprised him. Because it did not. A man near the lounge area whispered under his breath, "Wait, what did she say?" The woman beside him leaned closer. "Ownership," she repeated, softer but sharper. The word moved again, this time through people, through assumptions, through the invisible lines that had been drawn the moment Darius walked in. Richard straightened slowly, but the movement lacked the confidence it once carried. He adjusted his jacket, buying time he did not have. "There must be some confusion," he said, turning halfway toward Darius but not fully facing him yet. "These systems can mislabel accounts. It happens." Darius tilted his head slightly. Not dismissive, not aggressive, just precise. "Does it?" he asked. 2 words. That was all. But they landed heavier than anything said before, because they did not challenge the system. They challenged the man standing behind it. Richard finally turned completely now, forcing eye contact he had avoided seconds earlier. "If you are a registered owner or affiliated party," he said carefully, reconstructing his tone piece by piece, "then we can resolve this through proper channels. There is no need for escalation." Professionals. The phrase hung in the air like a last attempt at control. Darius let it sit there for a moment. Then he nodded once, almost thoughtfully. "That would have been useful," he said, his voice calm and even. "About 10 minutes ago." A shift moved through the lobby again. Subtle, but deeper this time, because now it was not just about what had been said. It was about what had already been done. The man recording lowered his phone slightly, not because the moment was over, but because it had changed. This was no longer spectacle. This was consequence. Emily spoke again, quieter now, but steady. "There is an internal note attached to the profile," she said. Richard did not respond immediately. He did not want more information. Not now. Not like this. But the room was no longer his to control. "Read it," someone murmured from behind. No one knew who said it. It did not matter. The request belonged to everyone. Emily hesitated for half a second, then read. "Full acquisition, pending final confirmation. Authorization priority, executive." The words did not rise. They did not need to. They dropped into the room like a final piece falling into place. Richard's expression changed again. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough for the people watching to see it. Enough for the staff behind him to feel it. Enough for the illusion to break. "Pending," Richard repeated quickly, clinging to the one word that sounded incomplete. "So nothing is finalized. This is still, it is already done." Darius did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He simply spoke, and that was enough to stop the sentence before it finished. Silence followed. Not awkward, not uncertain, just complete, because now the truth was no longer building. It was present, fully formed. The guard shifted again, this time stepping completely to the side, no longer positioned between Darius and the exit. Not instructed, not asked, just moved. Richard noticed. Of course he did. Authority recognizes when it is no longer supported. If that is the case, Richard said, his voice lower now, controlled but tight. Then I was not informed. It sounded like an explanation. It sounded like justification. But underneath it, something else had started to surface. Not power, not certainty, exposure. Darius looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with clarity. That is exactly the problem, he said. The words lingered long after Darius spoke them. Not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable. That is exactly the problem. They did not accuse. They exposed. And in a room built on quiet luxury and unspoken hierarchy, exposure carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Richard Halston stood there, still facing him, but no longer standing on solid ground. The authority he had relied on just minutes ago now felt like something borrowed, something temporary, something that could be taken back at any moment. Around them, the lobby had shifted again. No one was pretending anymore. The man near the lounge lowered his phone completely, no longer hiding the fact that he had been recording. A woman by the front desk crossed her arms, watching closely, her expression no longer passive but engaged. Even the staff behind the counter had changed. They were no longer aligned behind Richard. They were observing him, measuring him, waiting to see what he would do next. Emily remained still at her station, but her posture had changed. She was no longer hesitant. She was aware, and that awareness had a direction now. Richard cleared his throat, a small sound that felt louder than it should have. If there has been a miscommunication, he began, choosing each word carefully, then we can address it internally. There is no need to escalate this situation any further. Internally, the word echoed with a quiet irony, because everything about this moment had already moved beyond internal. The witnesses, the staff, the shifting tone of the room. This was no longer something that could be contained behind polished counters and controlled conversations. Darius took a slow step forward. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to change the distance between them. Just enough to make it clear that the space itself had shifted. You already escalated it, he said calmly. Richard's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. Not this time. You made a decision, Darius continued, his voice steady, based on what you thought you saw. And then you enforced it like it was policy. Each sentence landed with precision. No wasted words. No excess emotion. Just facts, delivered in a way that left no room to hide. A faint memory flickered behind his eyes, not visible to anyone else in the room, but present all the same. A smaller lobby. Years ago. Different city. Same tone. Same assumption. He had been younger then. Less patient. Still learning how the world measured people before it understood them. He had stood in a place like this before and heard the same message, dressed in different words. Not the image. Not the look. Not the fit. Back then, he had argued. Back then, he had tried to explain. It had not worked. This time, he had not explained anything. Because this time he did not need to. The room brought him back. Present again. Focused. Controlled. Richard shifted his stance, tried to recover ground that no longer existed. I was acting in the best interest of the property, he said, the words sounding rehearsed even as he spoke them. We have protocols for a reason. Protocols. Another word that tried to sound neutral. Another word that carried something else underneath it. Darius nodded slightly, as if considering it. Protocols are supposed to protect the business, he said, not expose it. A quiet ripple moved through the staff. Not loud, not obvious, but real, because they understood what that meant. They had seen moments like this before. Maybe not this exact moment, but enough to recognize the pattern. Emily looked down at the screen again, then back up. There was no uncertainty left in her expression now, just clarity. The system has updated, she said, her voice steady and clear. All eyes turned to her. Final confirmation just came through, she continued. The acquisition is complete. This time, the silence that followed was different. It was not building tension. It was the release of it. The moment when everything that had been uncertain became fixed. Permanent. Real. Richard did not move. For a second, he looked like he might speak again, like he might try to hold on to something that was already gone. But nothing came out, because there was nothing left to say that would change what had just been confirmed. The guard took another step back, fully disengaging now, no longer part of the interaction at all. The line that had once separated Darius from the rest of the space had disappeared completely. Darius looked around the lobby one more time. Not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as someone who understood exactly what this place was and what it had just revealed about itself. Then his eyes returned to Richard. "This is your lobby," he said quietly. "Your team, your standards." He paused for just a moment, not for effect, for clarity. "And this," he added, "is what you chose to show. No anger, no raised voice, just truth." And in that moment, it carried more power than anything else in the room. The confirmation did not need to be repeated. It had already settled into every corner of the lobby, into every glance, every held breath, every shifting stance that no one could quite control anymore. The acquisition was complete. Not pending, not processing. Done. And with that single shift, everything that had just happened no longer existed as a misunderstanding. It became a record, a moment that could not be undone, only remembered. Richard Halston stood frozen for a fraction longer than anyone expected. Not because he did not understand what had happened, but because he did, completely. The kind of understanding that does not arrive in pieces, but all at once. The kind that forces a person to replay their own words in their head and realize, too late, how they sound when the context changes. He started, but the word did not go anywhere. It hovered unfinished, like the rest of the authority he had been holding on to. Behind him, the staff shifted subtly, not stepping away, not abandoning him, but no longer anchored to him either. The alignment had broken, and once that breaks, it does not quietly repair itself. Emily straightened slightly, her hands now resting still on the desk instead of hovering uncertainly above the keyboard. She was no longer reacting. She was observing, learning. The system in front of her was no longer just data. It was evidence. The man near the lounge took a slow breath, lowering his phone entirely now, but not leaving. No one was leaving, because this was no longer about a scene. It was about resolution. Darius did not rush the moment. He did not step forward again. He did not press. He simply stood there, allowing the silence to do what it always does when left uninterrupted. It reveals. Richard finally exhaled, a controlled release that tried to reset something that could not be reset. "If I had been informed," he said, his voice quieter now, more measured, "this would have been handled differently." The sentence sounded reasonable. It sounded almost acceptable, but it carried a flaw that everyone in the room could now hear. Darius nodded once, slowly. "That is exactly what I wanted to understand," he said. Richard looked up, confusion flickering across his face. Not confusion about the situation, confusion about the intent. "Understand what?" he asked. Darius held his gaze steady, unblinking. "Whether this only happens when you do not know who someone is," he said, "or if this is just how you run your lobby." The question did not accuse. It did something more precise. It removed the excuse. And in doing that, it forced the truth into the open. Richard's shoulders shifted slightly, the posture of a man adjusting to pressure that could no longer be redirected. "We treat all guests with respect," he replied, but the sentence felt thinner than it sounded, because the room had just witnessed something else. A woman near the elevator spoke quietly, not to interrupt, but not to stay silent either. "That is not what we saw," she said. No one corrected her. No one dismissed it, because now the witnesses mattered, not as background, not as noise, but as confirmation. Darius did not look at her. He did not need to. The room was already speaking, and for the first time since he walked in, the balance had fully shifted, not in his favor, in the direction of truth. A faint memory surfaced again, sharper this time. A younger version of himself, standing in a different lobby, holding a confirmation number that meant nothing to the person behind the desk. The same pause, the same glance, the same quiet decision made before a single word was spoken. Back then, he had stood there longer than he should have, waiting for something to change. It had not. He had left. That moment had followed him for years. Not as anger, as clarity. Clarity about how easily people are measured when no one is watching. and how differently they're treated when someone is. He returned to the present, the memory dissolving as quickly as it came. Richard was still there. The staff was still there. The lobby, unchanged on the surface, now carried something different beneath it. Accountability. Darius reached into his pocket again, pulling out his phone with the same calm precision as before. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He simply tapped once and brought it to his ear. Yes, he said, his tone even. It is complete. A pause. Then, no adjustments needed. He lowered the phone again, his gaze moving briefly across the staff, then settling back on Richard. I do not need an apology, he said. I needed clarity. The sentence landed. Softly, but stayed, because it did not ask for anything. It defined everything. And in that moment, the lobby was no longer just a place. It was a reflection, and everyone in it knew exactly what it had just revealed. The word clarity did not fade after Darius spoke it. It stayed in the air, subtle but unshakable, like something the room itself needed to process. No one moved immediately. Not the staff, not the guests, not even Richard, because clarity, once spoken, removes the option of pretending. Richard inhaled slowly, his chest rising just enough to show the effort it took to remain composed. His eyes shifted, not away from Darius, but around him, as if searching for something that could anchor him again. Authority, structure, control, but none of it returned. Not in the way it had existed before. Mr. Coleman, he said finally, using the name for the first time, carefully, deliberately, as if saying it correctly might repair what had already been done. I want to acknowledge that this situation could have been handled differently. The sentence was measured, polished, the kind of statement designed to stabilize a moment, but it arrived too late to define it. Darius listened without interruption. He did not nod. He did not react. He simply allowed the words to exist exactly as they were. Richard continued, encouraged by the silence. We have standards here, he said, softer now, less certain. But those standards are meant to maintain the integrity of the experience for all guests. Integrity. Experience. The words sounded right. But in this moment, they felt like they belonged to a different version of the room. A version that no longer existed. Darius took a slow breath, not as a reaction, but as a reset. Then he spoke. Standards are not the problem, he said. The application of them is. The sentence landed with quiet precision. No edge, no emotion, just truth shaped into language. A few staff members exchanged brief glances. Not dramatic, not obvious, but meaningful, because they understood exactly what that meant. It was not about having rules. It was about who those rules were applied to and when. Emily looked down at the system again, then back up, her posture now fully aligned with the moment rather than resisting it. She was no longer unsure. She was present, and presence in a moment like this mattered more than position. Richard shifted his weight slightly, the subtle movement of someone recalibrating under pressure. If there are improvements that need to be made, he said, we are always open to reviewing internal processes. The phrasing was careful, strategic. It tried to move the conversation away from what had just happened and toward something more abstract, something less personal. But the room did not follow, because what had happened was not abstract. It was visible. It had witnesses. It had impact. Darius glanced briefly toward the front desk, then toward the guests who had not left, who had not looked away, who had stayed long enough to see the shift. Then he returned his focus to Richard. This is not about process, he said. It is about perception. The word settled differently than the others. It did not point to systems. It pointed to people, and that made it harder to deflect. A man near the lounge nodded slightly, almost unconsciously, as if the statement aligned with something he had seen before but never heard articulated so clearly. A woman by the elevator folded her arms tighter, her gaze fixed, her attention no longer passive. The room was not just listening now. It was absorbing. Richard's expression tightened again, but this time not from resistance, from recognition, because perception was not something he could adjust with policy. It was something that had already been revealed through action. We aim to treat every guest equally, he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt incomplete. Not false, just insufficient. Darius held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the statement itself. Then this, he said, gesturing lightly to the space around them without raising his hand fully, is your baseline. The sentence did not accuse. It defined. And once defined, it could not be easily reinterpreted. Silence followed again, but it was no longer tense. It was settled. The kind of silence that comes after something has been understood, whether accepted or not. Darius reached for his phone once more, glancing at the screen briefly before lowering it again, without making a call this time. Everything that needed to be set in motion was already moving. Everything that needed to be revealed had already been seen. He looked around the lobby one last time, not as someone entering or exiting, but as someone assessing. Not the design, not the lighting, but the culture, the response, the choices made when no one thought it mattered. Then his eyes returned to Richard, steady, calm, final. You did not recognize me, he said. That is not the issue. A pause, just long enough. You recognize something else, he added. And that was where the real problem lived. Not in the system, not in the process, but in the instinct that came before either of them. And in that moment, there was nothing left to explain. The silence that followed his last sentence did not feel empty. It felt precise, like a line had been drawn that no one in the room could step back across. You recognize something else. The words did not need explanation because everyone understood exactly what they meant, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. Richard Halston stood there, his posture still upright, but the structure behind it had changed. It was no longer supported by certainty. It was held together by awareness. Awareness of what had just been revealed, not by policy, not by process, but by instinct. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Not because he had nothing to say, but because anything he said now would only confirm what had already been exposed. Behind him, the staff no longer looked to him for cues. Their attention had shifted, not toward Darius as a figure of authority, but toward the moment itself, toward what it represented. Emily stood still, her eyes steady, no longer flicking between the screen and the room. She had already seen enough. The system had confirmed what the room had witnessed, and now both were aligned. A quiet movement came from the far side of the lobby. A man in a dark suit, older, composed, stepped forward from near the entrance. He had been there longer than most had noticed, watching without interruption, observing without reacting. Now he approached with measured steps, his presence calm but deliberate. He stopped a few feet from Darius, then gave a slight nod. Mr. Coleman, he said, his voice respectful, grounded. I just received confirmation from corporate. The words shifted the air again, not with tension, but with finality. Because corporate did not speculate. Corporate confirmed. Richard turned toward him instinctively, as if reaching for a structure he understood. And, he asked, his voice controlled but tight. The man did not look at him immediately. His focus remained on Darius. The transfer is complete, he said. Full ownership has been executed as of 9:48 this morning. A timestamp. Exact. Unavoidable. The room absorbed it in silence. 9:48. Just minutes after the first words had been spoken. Just minutes after the decision had been made. Richard's eyes shifted back to Darius, slower this time, more deliberate. Because now there was no uncertainty left. No pending that did. No process to hide behind. Just outcome. Darius met his gaze without change. No expression of triumph. No visible reaction. Just presence. Effective immediately, the man in the suit continued. All executive authority regarding this property falls under Mr. Coleman's discretion. The statement did not echo. It settled, and with it, the structure of the room rearranged itself completely. Not physically, but in meaning. The desk, the staff, the manager, the hierarchy that had existed minutes ago had been replaced by something else. Something real. Richard's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition. The kind that arrives when there is nothing left to reinterpret. I was not aware, he said again, but this time the words carried no defense. Only fact. Darius nodded once. That much is clear, he replied. A faint shift moved through the guests. Not loud, not dramatic, but present. A man near the lounge exhaled slowly. A woman by the elevator gave a small shake of her head, not in disbelief, but in understanding. Because they had seen this before. Maybe not here, maybe not like this, but enough to recognize the pattern. The difference now was that the pattern had been interrupted. Not by argument, not by force, but by truth. The man in the suit turned slightly, now addressing Richard directly. There will be a full internal review, he said, his tone even professional. All actions taken this morning will be documented and assessed. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to, because the statement itself carried weight. Not as a threat, as a consequence. Richard nodded slowly, once, absorbing the words without resistance. There was no point in resisting now. The moment had already defined itself. Darius glanced briefly around the lobby again, taking in the room one final time. The same marble floors, the same lighting, the same space that had, just minutes ago, tried to push him out. But now it stood differently. Not because it had changed, because it had been revealed. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the front desk, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. Then he spoke. "You asked me to leave," he said, his voice steady, measured. "In a building I just acquired." He paused, not for effect, but for clarity. Then he added, "That is not a misunderstanding." The words landed with finality. Not loud, not aggressive, but complete. And in that moment, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to question, nothing left to defend. Only the truth of what had happened, standing in the center of the room, exactly where it had always been. The words did not need to echo to be understood. They stayed in the air long enough for everyone to feel the weight of them, to measure what had just been said against what had just been done. That is not a misunderstanding. It was a conclusion, not an argument, not a reaction. A conclusion drawn from behavior that had already revealed itself. No one spoke immediately after. Not the staff, not the guests, not even the man in the suit who had just confirmed the transfer. Because the moment had reached its peak, and anything said too quickly would only dilute what had already settled. Richard Halston lowered his gaze briefly, not in surrender, but in recalibration. When he looked up again, the expression had changed. Not confident, not defensive, just aware, fully aware of where he stood, and more importantly, how he got there. "Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice controlled but stripped of its earlier sharpness. "On behalf of this property, I take responsibility for how this situation was handled." The sentence was direct. No qualiforce, no redirección. It landed cleaner than anything he had said before. Darius listened, his posture unchanged, his expression steady. He did not interrupt. He did not acknowledge immediately. Because responsibility, once spoken, needs to stand on its own for a moment. The room watched closely. Not out of curiosity now, but out of expectation. This was the part where things either shifted forward or tried to retreat backward. And no one in that lobby wanted to see it retreat. Richard continued, slower now, choosing his words without the urgency that had defined him earlier. "There were assumptions made," he said, "and those assumptions should not have been made." He stopped there. No explanation, no justification, just the truth stated plainly. A quiet ripple moved through the guests. Not applause, not reaction, just acknowledgement. Because for the first time since this began, the language matched the reality. Darius nodded once. Small, controlled, not approval, recognition. "Assumptions are not random," he said. "They come from patterns." The sentence shifted the focus again, not to the moment, but to what created it. Because this was never just about 10 minutes. It was about everything that came before those 10 minutes. Emily's eyes lowered briefly, her expression thoughtful now, as if replaying the interaction from the beginning, not to defend it, but to understand it. Other staff members stood still, no longer moving, no longer whispering, just present in a way they had not been before. The man in the suit stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Coleman," he said, "we are prepared to implement immediate corrective actions based on your direction." The offer was clear. Authority had transferred. Now it was being acknowledged. Darius glanced at him briefly, then back at Richard, then across the room. He did not rush to answer, because decisions made in moments like this define more than just outcomes. They define standards. No immediate actions, he said finally. The response was unexpected. It did not carry punishment. It carried intention. Richard's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in anticipation. Because sometimes restraint carries more weight than reaction. What happens next, Darius continued, should not be about what you do because I'm standing here. His gaze moved across the staff, not lingering, but deliberate. It should be about what you do when no one is watching. The words settled deeper than anything before them, because they extended beyond the moment, beyond the room, into the culture itself. A guest near the lounge nodded slowly, almost instinctively. A woman by the elevator shifted her stance, her expression softer now, not because the tension had disappeared, but because the direction had changed. This was no longer confrontation. It was correction. Richard absorbed the words in silence, not resisting them, not deflecting them, just holding them, because he understood what they meant. Not for today, for everything after today. Darius took a slow step back, creating space again, returning the room to itself, but not to its previous state. That version was gone, replaced by something clearer, something more honest. He slipped his phone back into his pocket, his movements unhurried, controlled, final. Then he looked at Richard one last time. You do not fix this by responding to me, he said. You fix this by changing what made it possible. No anger, no emphasis, just direction. And in that moment, the lobby did not feel the same. It looked the same. It sounded the same. But it carried something new beneath it. Awareness, accountability, and the understanding that what had just happened would not disappear when the room emptied. It would remain in decisions, in actions, in standards, exactly where it should have been all along. The lobby did not return to normal after that. It could not. Not because anything physical had changed, but because everyone in that room had seen something they could not unsee. The marble still reflected the same light. The air still carried the same quiet luxury. But the meaning behind it had shifted. Permanently. Darius Coleman did not rush to leave. He did not turn away the moment the conversation ended. He remained there for a few seconds longer, not as a guest waiting for service, not as an outsider being evaluated, but as someone who now defined the space itself. And in that stillness, the room adjusted to him, not the other way around. Richard Halston stood across from him, no longer trying to recover authority, no longer reaching for language that could reshape the moment. He understood now that nothing he said could reverse what had been revealed. The only thing left was what he would do after this. And for the first time, that was not something he could control in the moment. Emily took a small breath, then another, as if grounding herself in what she had just witnessed. Her posture was different now, straighter, not because she had been told to stand that way, but because she had seen the cost of not doing so. Around her, the rest of the staff remained still, no longer moving with routine, no longer hiding behind motion. They were present, fully present, and that presence carried weight. The man in the suit stepped back slightly, giving space where it was now understood to belong. The guests, one by one, began to shift, not leaving in a hurry, not dispersing like a crowd after a scene, but moving with a quiet awareness that they had just witnessed something larger than a moment. A woman near the elevator gave a final glance toward Darius, not curious, not questioning, but respectful. A man near the lounge slipped his phone into his pocket, not because the moment was over, but because it had reached its conclusion. No recording could add more to what had already been seen. Darius finally moved, one step forward, then another, not toward the exit, toward the center of the lobby, toward the space that had tried to push him out just minutes earlier. And as he walked, no one stopped him. No one questioned him. No one even considered it, because the question of belonging had already been answered. He paused briefly, his gaze moving across the room one last time. Not searching, not measuring, just seeing. Seeing the staff who now understood the weight of their roles. Seeing the guest who had chosen to stay and witness instead of look away. Seeing the space itself, no longer as a symbol of exclusion, but as something that now carried responsibility. Then he spoke, Not loudly, not for effect, but clearly enough that the room could hear him. "This place does not define who belongs," he said. The words were simple, but they carried more than the moment. "People do." He let that settle, not as a lesson, not as a correction, as a standard, because standards, once spoken clearly, have a way of reshaping everything around them. He turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with quiet finality. And as he walked toward the elevator, the path in front of him opened without hesitation. Not because anyone had been told to move, but because they understood. The doors slid open with a soft sound, smooth, precise, expected. Darius stepped inside, then turned slightly, just enough to look back at the lobby one last time. Not to check, not to confirm, just to acknowledge what had just happened within it. Richard remained where he was, his posture no longer rigid, his expression no longer guarded. He watched, not as a manager observing a guest, but as someone who had just been shown the difference between authority and leadership. The doors began to close, slowly, quietly, and just. Before they met, Darius spoke once more, his voice steady, unchanged. "I did not raise my voice," he said. A brief pause. Then, "I raised the standard." The doors closed completely, and with them, the moment ended. But what remained did not disappear. It stayed in the way the staff would greet the next person who walked through those doors. It stayed in the decisions made when no one was watching. It stayed in the quiet understanding that power does not always announce itself, but it always reveals itself. And in that lobby, on that morning, it had done exactly that.